Good day, everybody. This is Steve, the amateur historian. Technically podcast number 2, but officially with the better equipment, it is podcast. It's the first legit podcast. Now, as I said in my sort of little intro podcast that I recorded just walking to the store and back, I'm going to start doing these again, but I'm going to keep them a little bit more focused on... Each one's going to have kind of a certain individual aspect to focus on that I'm going to kind of know going in, sitting down, in place, audio recording, knowing what I'm going to talk about. Whereas the kind of mock ones that I did for my old channel were more just me kind of recording myself. Hey, I have some time to kill. Let's just think of something to talk about. Literally almost half of those I did not know what I was going to talk about when I first hit the record button. I recorded them on my phone, and they were just kind of just for fun. I want these to be a little bit more focused. And apologies if you hear some traffic outside. I have my window open, even though it's like 40 degrees outside. I am a demi. I left my apartment for almost 2 days. And a few days before I left, I actually had to turn the heat on in my room for the first time since, like, March. And I had to get up real early for work. You know, knew I was going to go to work, go to my girlfriend's place, be gone for, a while before coming back. So I was like, don't forget to turn the heat off. One, for safety, and two, you don't need it on while you're not here. So in my blind stumbling about, right before I left, walked up to the heater, grabbed the little knob, turned it in the wrong direction. I come home today, it is like 90 degrees in my room because the heat has been turned all the way up on max for almost 2 days. So I can only assume that our electrical bill is going to be a little bit higher than past months. But you know what? Life goes on. And we're not here to talk about the heat of my room. We're not even here to talk about the weather. I figured for the inaugural podcast, what am I going to focus it on? Well, what have I been focusing my life on more than anything else, especially in terms of the stuff I put on my channel? That is the infamous torso murder that happened in Portland in 1946, which I have just been contaminating my YouTube channel with because I'm doing a documentary film on it. It's been like the one thing I've been studying for the past almost 2 months and kind of configuring how I want to make a film about it. I'm always studying and, searching and trying to discover new things. Historically, the realm of crime, things of that nature. I'm always looking for new stuff. So this is kind of a rare instance where I've kind of put anything else I'm interested in looking into on hold for the sake of focusing in just on this crime. Now, it's a really fun thing to talk about because unless you know me and I've been talking your ear off about this thing, or unless you're from Portland and you know the history of the area, this is going to be a completely obscure crime to you. When people think torso murder, torso killer, they probably think, and again, you have to know crime history, U.S. history, to even know about this one, and that is the case of the Cleveland torso killer who killed, it's not firmly known exactly where he killed. A lot of the bodies of the people he killed turned up along the lake, along railroad lines. A lot of them were transients. A lot of them were never identified, so we don't really know who they were. And some they could hyperbolize were transients by the, condition of their skin if they were discovered. soon enough, but that was the first big case in terms of establishing the term torso killer. And the person was known as that because the killer dismembered people, and a lot of the people, their torso would turn up somewhere, or he would bisect the torso. Sometimes, two different parts of the torso of the same person would be found. Scared the living hell out of the city. This is the 1930s, so, as far as crime goes, people are used to, someone getting shot, maybe somebody getting stabbed in a mugging or a bank robbery or something, but when someone's just grabbing people and hacking their bodies up, that was a whole new ballgame in the 1930s. And you fast forward a bit, one of the most famous dismemberment crimes of all time was the Black Dahlia murder, which happened almost 9 months to the day after this particular case that I'm going to talk about, the 1946 torso murder that happened just south of Portland, Oregon, really close to my old stomping grounds. At least that's where the story broke. And I'm going to just focus on talking about the case. I'm not going to delve into what is going to be a substantial chunk of my documentary, which is the case of this particular woman named Anna Schrader, who lived in Portland, disappeared right about the time that this torso victim would have been killed. So there's lots of reasons to think that she was probably the victim. It's still an unsolved crime. It's probably going to forever remain an unsolved crime. There's practically no evidence left. There's nothing really to go on. Anybody who was involved, from people who just had general knowledge of the crime, up to the person or persons who were involved in the killing, are almost guaranteed to all be dead. This crime happened over 71 years ago. So, even if the killer was some teenager, that teenager would be pushing 90 by now. So, nobody is going to come out and make a confession unless they told, somebody told their son this story and told him to keep quiet about it, and one day they decide it's not worth keeping a secret anymore. This crime is never going to be solved to 100% certainty. It's just one of those things. The Zodiac crimes have a better chance of being solved to 100% certainty than this torso murder in Portland. Granted, the Zodiac killer is a much larger case and a lot more people are invested in it. This torso case in Portland, it was national news when it broke, but it quickly faded. And it seems like, there was political and legal motivation to push that, to try to get the case off of the front page of the papers as quickly as possible. But what I was getting into real fast, you've got the Cleveland torso killer before, you have the Black Dahlia, which happens in January of 1947 down in Los Angeles. This woman is found, I believe, on the morning of January 15th by a woman with her child. She's bisected pretty much at the hip, so she's pretty much almost evenly just cut in two. She'd had, it was a really kind of gruesome crime scene. She'd had her smile, cut, pretty much someone took a knife, put it in her mouth, and cut up her cheek on both sides to make it this big, huge smile on her face. Absolutely frightening. Now, the woman that was murdered, unlike this torso case where not only is the killer never been known, but the victim has still not been identified. That's more what I was discussing when I was talking about how the case is never going to be solved. I wasn't talking so much about how they're not going to find out who was the killer or who was directly involved if there were more than one person. I was talking about the victim. The victim to this day is not known, but this Anna Schrader woman is the most likely of all the possibilities. And there aren't really a whole lot. There were a lot of people that came out of the woodwork when they heard that this torso of a woman was discovered, and that's how the case first broke. There were people all the way to the East Coast who were sending letters to Portland saying, my sister's been missing, my wife has been missing, my friend's wife has been missing. All of these women that, it was, the last time I saw them, they were leaving town with a strange man, or my friend who I haven't seen in forever, who disappeared, was dating this really mean, jealous, violent guy, and it was just this laundry list of all these women that were obviously gotten themselves into just horrible relationships and or life situations, and then just disappeared. And they were all hoping, if anything, for some closure. Maybe this torso victim is my friend, my wife, my sister, what have you. But Anna Schrader there was a lot of similarities between Anna Schrader, things that happened in her life, and Elizabeth Short, who was the Black Dahlia victim. Only difference was the age, but there's a lot of similarities between them, like how they were, things that happened in their lives. They both were these very attractive, dark-haired, light-skinned women who were born in these little towns that, fled them for greener pastures, wanted to be seen, wanted to get known, things like that. So that's interesting, and then the fact that they happened so close together. So this Portland case kind of got lost in the shuffle with other cases like that. And it's known that while the last discoveries in this case were being made, you go over eastward again, over to Chicago, you've got this lipstick killer, who, going back into 1945, had been going around Chicago, and every, couple of months he'd kill off another woman. His last victim in 1946 was a 6-year-old girl named Suzanne Degnan. And it's very interesting. Some people have theorized that the lipstick killer and the Black Dahlia killer were the same person. And one of the things they used to correlate that is that the lipstick killer's last victim was Susan Degnan. And there was a road by the name of Degnan that was like a block or two away from where the Black Dahlia Elizabeth Short's body was found. And some theorize that was the killer trying to make a connection, and that he intended to put the body along Degnan. I think it was Degnan Boulevard is what it was called. But then he screwed up. And I'm thinking, how the hell do you screw that up? It is kind of a far-fetched theory. I guess you can't 100% say it's not the case. Especially since, in the terms of the lipstick killer, the guy that went down for it and spent, the remaining almost 70 years of his life in prison for it, I don't think he was the guy. Pretty much, this crime had people all over Chicago scared out of their friggin' minds. And then it jumped to a whole other level when this, 6-year-old girl is brutally murdered. Now everything gets bumped up a notch. And, the more time passes, the more people are flipping out, the more they're commanding their police force. Solve this damn crime. We're frightened. And so they ultimately got their hands on this 17-year-old petty criminal kid named William Hirons, winner of the John Krasinski lookalike contest when he was a kid. And, they roughed him up. They pretty much scared the shit out of this guy who, may have been a petty criminal, but he was still only 17 years old. And finally they got the guy to admit that he was the killer, even though details he gave didn't match the official story. And then he, reneged on the confession, I think, within days. And there's so many reasons to show that he wasn't the killer, and that he was just a scapegoat to get the townspeople off of the Chicago police's ass in this case. And it is true that after Hirons was taken in, the killing, at least as far as we know, did stop. There's no official further victims of the lipstick killer. So, if you want to look at that as proof that he was the killer, go ahead. It's still pretty thin. So that was what was going on around this particular case, this torso killer in Portland, or a torso killing, because there's No real evidence to suggest that this case was part of a spree killing or a mass killing or some serial killer was going around torso killing people up and down Portland. It wasn't all that rare for, dead bodies of women to turn up in the Willamette River, which is main river, cuts through the Portland area. If you see any pictures of downtown Portland, you see it. There's a river going through there. That's the Willamette. Oh, excuse me. I'm having to stretch my. My muscles are tight. But you've got a very dark history to Portland, and today there's all this gentrification, and everybody's trying to make like Portland's just always been this darling hub of awesomeness and acceptance and so on and so forth. But it's got a very dark racial history, and it's got a very dark history of police corruption, and a lot of that police corruption ties into the lives that women lived in Portland during this time. A lot of women were forced into prostitution. Lots of women's, Portland was kind of known as a transient town, which didn't necessarily mean back then. Today we think of transient, we think of homeless, but the term transient more referred to workers who didn't really have a specific career. They would just kind of bounce around from odd job to odd job in the Portland area. That was more what transients were back in the early 20th century. So you got a lot of women that are married to these poor, angry, drunken transient workers who, get beaten up if they open their mouth the wrong way, say the wrong thing. And you've got a lot of women who frequented bars. If there were transient women, transient and more of the homeless concept, they would go into bars and try to find guys to hook up with just to get a place to stay for the night. And a lot of these guys were, the worst of the worst. So, they'd say, oh, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'll give you a place to stay. And then they'd, if the woman did anything to piss the guy off, he'd beat the hell out of them. And, in a lot of those cases, women got beaten to death. That was, unfortunately, I don't want to say a super common thing in Portland, but much more common than it should have been, even back then. So you've got this world in the, the 10s, 20s, 30s, where women aren't treated very well, and kind of the best thing you could get in most cases was to just be a wife and be married to a guy that had an okay job and didn't beat the hell out of you all the time. And on top of things, primarily after the Portland Exposition, the Lewis and Clark Exposition in 1905, that was practically to the level of a World's Fair, Portland's population skyrocketed. Suddenly everybody wanted to come to Portland when they saw this cool stuff that was going on, and women actually started flocking there at a higher percentage than men. The female population in Portland during the 10s and 20s just exploded, and Anna Schrader was one of those people. She came to Portland in 1910 looking for a better life, looking for excitement that she wasn't going to find in this small little town she grew up in Minnesota. And so it was not rare at all for women to turn up dead in Portland, and it was, if it was a prostitute, it was swept under the rug, nobody cared. But then we get to April 12th, 1946, and the torso of a woman is discovered in the Willamette River. And this is completely different from any of these crimes against women that people knew about and knew were happening back in the day. So this shook everyone, and it was national news when it was discovered. There was three folks down along the river on the east side, which this is, even today, is regarded as the northwestern kind of fringe of the community of Oak Grove, which is a couple miles south of Portland, and I lived in Oak Grove on the same streets in two different houses from 1992 to 2009. So I really pretty much grew up in Oak Grove, and I lived only about a mile down the street from where these three people were walking down the river, and they saw this burlap sack that used to hold feed from a feed mill company up in North Portland. And they saw it floating in the water. One of the people thought it was a bag of drowned cats, and they pulled it ashore, opened it up, and it was the torso of a woman. The arms had been cut off, the head had been cut off, the legs had been cut off. It was just this slab of a human body. And that's where the case started. It was like, boom, just instant national news. And it exploded locally. You know, people, you had to wonder, is there a mass murdering maniac on our hands? Is this a spree killer, or are more people going to turn up dead? Was this an isolated incident? Nobody can know for sure. We still don't even know to this day all the details of this crime, but people were freaking out. People were, like I said before, even out of state, thousands of miles away, people were inquiring if it was their loved one. And the problem was all these letters that came in and all this local searching for missing persons and things like that, it wasn't really going to help, because they couldn't establish an identity of this person. She'd been in this sack and floating in the water, and there's no hands, so you can't fingerprint them. There's no head, so you can't examine their dental records or just look at their face and match it to photographs. I mean, it was just a torso. There was, I mean, what are you going to do with that? So it became a case real quick. The police started searching the river in the vicinity of where this torso was found, just off the shore in Oak Grove. But one of the things that sparked was reminders for people. And the moment that this story broke, and it was reported that, this body parts of a human had been found in a burlap sack, a couple of boat workers down in Oregon City, which is about 6 or so miles south of Oak Grove, along the river, and there's mills all through there, just a lot of working people. And a couple of guys recalled seeing a burlap sack kind of just floating around in the river a couple weeks before. They went back down there to the site. They found the bag. It was fortunately still there. They pulled it ashore. We have the arms and the right thigh, from the top part of the leg down to the knee, had been stuffed into this burlap sack, and the cut marks were examined, and it was determined that they were from the same woman that they'd found this torso for upstream. Now, this is the next day, so in pretty much less than 24 hours, a torso was found. The arms, which still didn't have the hands, so again, no chance for fingerprinting. Had the, hands even been in good enough condition for that to be a possibility. So you've got all these body parts being found from the same victim, and you have the police theorizing there was a railroad bridge that crossed the river right by where the torso was found. So the initial theory was somebody threw all these body parts from the bridge into the river. But then you have the torso that practically didn't go anywhere. And then you have the sack that has the arms and the right thigh in them, and they end up like 6 miles downstream. So, pretty quickly the police had to start rethinking their theory, and I don't think that they were all thrown from this bridge. Parts just ended up in too odd of places for that to happen. And then nothing happened for a while, literally months. And, they have these body parts, all the leads are going nowhere. And it's becoming a cold case about as quickly as one can. There's just nothing to go on. They don't have enough identifiable parts. Then comes July 27th, and another burlap bag is pulled ashore, this one in the Clackamas River, but only a couple hundred feet off of where the Clackamas River and the Willamette River meet. And it was also discovered near a bridge. There's a highway bridge that crosses the Clackamas River from the north down into the south into Oregon City. So this is pretty close to the mills, to Willamette Falls, all that stuff where the hands and right thigh were found. This particular burlap sack contained the left thigh. So the topmost part of the leg down to the knee once again. Just a chunk of flesh. But by this time, it's the summer. Locally, it's a big find, but nationally, nobody's really paying attention to this torso case anymore. And during the summer is when William Hirons in Chicago is finally getting busted, and he's made his confession. And, as far as criminal stories go, Chicago was a bigger city. There were more victims in this case. One of the victims was a child. They actually had a suspect. That suspect was making a confession. There was this wild concept, the fact that he was called the lipstick killer because after he'd kill someone, he would use the woman's lipstick to write messages on the wall saying, please stop me before I kill again. I can't control this. So it was just a bigger story, and it had a conclusion. It was the big criminal story of 1946. The Portland torso case just kind of fell off the radar. Fast forward a couple of weeks to August 15th. A mess of hair along a scalp also found in the Willamette River. A little bit further, a couple hundred feet further north from where the arms and the right thigh were found. You have this mess of hair with maybe a little bit of scalp mangled around a log cable, and that was examined. People thought that may have belonged to the victim. And then you go ahead a couple more months to October 13th, still 1946. And the last discovery is made. In the same general spot where the torso had been found, where the whole case began, they found, and this was not in a burlap sack, but rather was wrapped up in some newspaper and pieces of a tan shirt. They found the head of the victim, which is, I've seen a picture of the head, and it's all, the skin's all blackened, but it's still like a face. It's not skeletal at this point, and it had like binding wrapped around the mouth, so the mouth was forced open so you can see the teeth, and the face almost seems to be, in one way, it almost looks like it's laughing maniacally at you, and in another way, it almost looks like it's just screaming for help. Like, they're two completely different emotions, yet it almost looks like they're both being conveyed. The eyes were gone, kind of the remains were there of the backside, but the actual eyeballs were gone. They're just black spots. And yeah, the skin is just this blackened, probably greenish, just gross looking. But you see the teeth in there, and you think, okay, we can do this. We can identify this woman now. She's got teeth. We can check her dental records. They may have not had DNA back in 1946, but they sure as hell were able to identify based on dental records. And the head, when it was examined, the top teeth, the upper teeth of the victim were all false, pretty much dentures, or exactly dentures. And the bottom teeth were still natural. They just had the teeth had a lot of fillings in them, but they were still natural. They could still be examined to try and establish an identification, finally, for this victim. That never happened. There's not even any evidence, at least as far as I've been able to find, that they even tried to identify her based on dental records. It's one thing to try to do it and then to not succeed. Maybe the test just doesn't work, or whoever it is, they don't have a chart for this person, so they just don't know. But it wasn't even that. It seems like they just didn't even bother. So you have to wonder, like, if the test came back negative for some reason, they would have come out and said it. If it came back positive and identified somebody, you bet they would have come out and said something like that. Unless there was some form of motive to say no. Whatever you found in this test, don't say a thing about it. So, I have a feeling if they were tested, it came back and positively identified somebody, and it was somebody that authorities didn't want identified. Either that, or the test wasn't done, because kind of along the same lines, you could say people didn't want a certain someone to be identified as the victim, so they just quashed it and said, no, don't do the test. Whatever the people say, if they get pissed, whatever. We'll just move along. And then even if they come out and say, which they still didn't, if they do come out and say, hey, this thing failed, we still don't know who the person is, they're still covered. The victim is still not identified. And that's one of the main reasons why, till today, we do not know who this victim is. We can only use what we've got to hypothesize. And it's funny, one of the state police captain who was involved in Oregon, the state case investigating this unsolved crime, when he was asked, why were you never able to identify who this woman was? He flat out said we couldn't identify her because we never found her head, which would imply, had we found her head, we could have done a dental examination, which shows that they were all thinking about it. We found this head, we can use dental records to identify the victim. It's 1, 2, 3, it's easy as can be. But you have this state police captain who was the head of the investigation for the state on this crime, and he comes out and says something that even a novice, someone like myself, would know is nonsense. Everybody knows the frickin' head was found. And yet that was this guy's justification for why the victim was never identified. And that's just one thing. I am personally of the belief, whether there was a dental examination or not, the test itself was either quashed completely, or the results, if they were done, were quashed completely because they identified, or would have identified, somebody that those in power did not want identified. And again, I'm not going to go into Anna Schrader, but there is a reason why that is of significance in her case. My personal belief is that whoever the victim was, the Portland police in particular, did not want the identity of this person to come about. Now, you'd think, let's say the Portland police, they were crooked as hell back then. They were involved in prostitution, bootlegging, all sorts of other crime. So it wouldn't be beyond them to have to kill some random woman off because she saw something she shouldn't have seen or whatever. Now, so you'd think, like, whoever this woman was, if the police were directly involved, obviously this woman would have had to pose some kind of threat against them. And again, that gets back into the Anna Schrader territory. But even if you completely put Anna Schrader on the shelf, I mean, at the end of the day, you have lots of evidence that suggests the Portland police were in on this. First of all, these body parts were all found in Clackamas County. Portland is in Multnomah County. The Portland police had no jurisdiction on this case, and yet they got directly involved practically from the get-go, even though the actual investigation itself started with Clackamas County, and then the state police got involved later. But the Portland police just dived on into this thing and, just to do whatever they could, and yet they weren't really helpful. If anything, they were quashing things, just like state police saying the head was never found when it was. And there was a particular officer who was pretty high up in the ranks named Jim Purcell, who was pretty much a master of quashing investigations. If the Portland police didn't want something looked into, this guy would see to it that it got done. So it's not remotely out of the realm of possibility that the police, as well as Jim Purcell, could have gotten involved in this case and tried to quash it. And there's just so much crazy stuff happening. All the evidence of the case, within a couple of years, just disappears. There's no explanation for it. There was a guy, right after the torso was found, who called authorities and said he knew the identity of the victim. He knew where she'd been cut up. He remembered the last time he'd seen her. And it got reported to the Portland police because the guy was making a call from downtown Portland, and they went and they grabbed him. And, all reports say, okay, they grabbed the guy, they heard what he had to say, and in the end, they were just kind of like, yeah, we don't know if we believe this guy. But who's to say that they didn't beat the guy up? Who's to say this didn't happen? Who's to say that didn't happen? Something I noticed very interesting. In all of these, I found about 5 or 6 old newspapers that reference the case of this dude coming out and saying, I know the victim, and the police talked to him and they said, we don't buy your story, bro. By all accounts, this guy did have a criminal past, so you could say this guy was trying to gain leverage of some kind, or, using this case to try to benefit himself in some way. But how, I don't know. It seems like I don't think the guy was in jail when he made the call. I just don't really know what the guy would have been using the case for. But what is most interesting about that aspect is that all of these newspaper articles, and I noticed this consistency that happens in regards to this aspect of the case, and that is that they talk about what happened. This guy called these police. They contacted the Portland police. The Portland police came and grabbed the guy. He told them this, and they decided, we question whether this guy knows anything, and then everything stops, and they just go off to something else about the case. There's no effort to resolve the matter in that case. They don't talk about what he said that made them feel that way. They don't mention his name. They don't mention the name that he said was the victim's name. They don't mention where the guy supposedly said the victim was all cut up. That's all just been details that have been quashed and lost. We don't even know who this guy was. It wouldn't surprise me if you were able to go back into Portland Police's old documents that you wouldn't find any report on this guy. It's probably been destroyed, or hell, there maybe never was one. And if there was, or if there was an effort to make one, someone high up would have been like, let's just let this one go. Let's forget this. We don't need this in our files. So there was a lot of stuff going on, and the Portland police just seemed to want to hush it all up. And then, like I was saying earlier, when you think about the fact that this case, was national news when it first happened, and so quickly it became forgotten, like completely forgotten. By the 50s, there were people, maybe in the Pacific Northwest didn't know what the hell this case was. I've brought it up to everyone I've mentioned it to. Hell, I didn't even know it existed. The only way I found out about it was I do general research. Every couple of weeks I'll go on to these really cool websites that talk about, these kind of small, forgotten moments in Oregon history. You've got, Offbeat Oregon, which is really cool. The author, one of the authors that I interview in my film, J.D. Chandler, he writes for the Slabtown Chronicle, which is where I first discovered the story of the Torso Killer, and then the story of Anna Schrader, and why they think she's potentially the victim. And there's a lot more stuff. Like, this guy has done a lot of writing. He's written at least 4 books. He co-wrote one with Teresa Griffin Kennedy, who I also got to interview with them. So I literally, in the same room at the same time, got to talk to these two that co-authored this book called Murder and Scandal in Prohibition Portland. Yes! I finally remembered the full title. I always forget the scandal part. They co-wrote that book together, and they discuss all the crime and vice that was happening in Portland and all these figures that were involved and how Anna Schrader was connected to a lot of these figures. And they almost kind of end by discussing this torso killing and asking themselves, like, was it Anna Schrader? Who was this woman? This forgotten torso victim who's still never been identified. You know, we still don't know the circumstances that surround what happened to this woman. And I have a very definite theory, which I'm obviously not going to unlay out in detail here. I'm not even finished making the film. The last thing I want to do is blow the last, 10 minutes of it telling you exactly how I feel things unraveled in terms of just the information that I have at hand altogether. But yeah, so that's where I first discovered this case, was on about Slabtown Chronicle, which is a really good blog. But he writes a Weird Portland blog. I think he has at least 3 or 4 blogs that he also writes for. And it's just all very cool, very interesting stuff. A lot of stuff that is kind of forgotten in history, which makes me really happy that it's coming back up. And that's where I discovered this case. And the moment that I saw, because I was thinking, okay, this will make probably a pretty cool YouTube video or whatever. And then when I discovered that this happened like a mile from where I grew up, and that it was an unsolved murder, and then I started reading about Anna Schrader, and then the political and police corruption of the early 20th century in Portland, I realized this is going to be a lot bigger than just a YouTube video. And that's when I decided to bust out my recently replaced Canon DSLR camera, bust out my my shotgun mic, which I'm using to record these because sound quality, I mean, come on. And I bought this shotgun mic actually spring of 2015. I was gonna finally shoot a feature film, and I was like, I gotta upgrade from the video mic to a real shotgun mic. And I used it on that film. That film wrapped in November of 2015, so about 2 years ago. And I haven't used my shotgun mic since. The first time I used my shotgun mic, there may have been a time or two after I was done shooting my film that I used it. But pretty much from November 2015 till October 2017, just a couple weeks ago, I pretty much hadn't used my shotgun mic. And I was thinking when I pulled it out to get all my stuff together to prep to go to do this big interview that was going to be significant to my film, I was thinking, like, is the battery that I had in there when I was shooting my film back in 2015 still in there? And then you twist it, and I opened it, and the battery was still in there, and it had started to deteriorate. But fortunately, oh so fortunately, the substance that had drained out of the battery was practically a powder, and it hadn't done any damage to the interior, kind of the battery chamber, if you will. So I was just like, whew! I was like, oh man, and it wasn't even just the like, right now I gotta drop money to buy a new shotgun mic. It was the like, I'm doing an interview in 2 days, and now I don't have a good microphone to do it with. So it was more the immediate urgency of the situation that made me concerned that maybe I fried my mic by just, I took time off from doing real solid filmmaking, and I just kind of forgot about my shotgun mic and forgot that there was a battery still in there, as a little side note. But yeah, that interview experience, I've never recorded an interview, and I thought it was going to be kind of a standard, set up the camera, film one person, ask them the questions, move to the other person, set up the camera, ask them the questions, they give their answers or whatever. And it was just crazy to get into this room, and I'm here with these like historians, and J.D. Chandler's like this, like the authority on Portland history kind of in this area. And I'm sitting there, and I'm opening up my bag, and I'm pulling out my tripod and getting my camera set on it. I'm plugging my audio stuff in. And they're immediately just starting to talk about historical events I didn't even know about. Or if it was an event that I did know about, they would start talking about it, like this covert kind of secret aspect of it that I didn't know about. And it took me almost 20 minutes to get set up because I would stop, getting my stuff together, and I would just start listening to what they were talking about. I'm like, man, this is some cool stuff. Like, all this history that they know. And they were just spitballing things back and forth, like they were just having a general conversation about something that they'd watched on Netflix the night before. So it was a new experience, but it was a really exciting experience, and we ended up, and I didn't know how well it was going to turn out, but now that I'm cutting the film together, I'm actually kind of liking the rugged guerrilla filmmaker kind of essence of the whole thing, which is, instead of just doing a standard interview type setup, we just had JD sitting over here, Teresa sitting over here. I would ask a question, have the camera rolling, and they would just talk. It was more of a dialogue than just generally answering interview questions. And I would just film them and go back and forth between the two of them until they both just kind of looked at me like, I think we're out. I don't think we have anything more to say on that. And it allowed them to transition into other aspects of the case. They actually answered questions I had before I had asked them. So when you get down the line, there was questions I didn't even have to ask. And it was real quick. I think it was a little less than an hour and a half that we got this whole thing done. And I got all this video and this audio with it, and I learned new things about the case that I didn't know, which I was really, really hoping was going to happen. So it was just a really awesome experience, and it added just so much to my film. It changed the way I was editing it. I came up with new things to interject and discuss based on things I learned through talking to them. So on the one end, getting the footage for the film was great, but getting to talk to them and getting all this new information just kicked it all up to another level. So I have very, definite opinions, and talking to them helps solidify a lot of those opinions. But I am very convinced that, without going too much further into it, as I said I wasn't going to do, I don't think this was I think it was an isolated incident in that it wasn't part of a string of killings. But I don't feel like it was isolated in that just one person got pissed at a woman and killed her. I think there were multiple people involved, and likely the Portland police were involved. And beyond that, probably local organized crime, because the two worked hand in hand. And again, why? Why are the Portland police remotely getting involved in this case? If it's not even in their jurisdiction, why are they keeping hush-hush about so much stuff? Why did this case disappear so quickly? Why could they not identify this victim even after they found her head with some of her natural teeth still intact? It should have happened, and it didn't. So there's all those questions that, if these things wouldn't have happened if this was just some guy that got pissed and killed off his girlfriend or his sister or some woman that pissed him off or something like that. They would have busted the guy. They would have been like, "Oh, you scumbag." Brought him in, busted him, tried him, convicted him, throw him in the clink. None of that stuff happened, though. So I think that the ramifications of this overall case go far beyond one single killer and one single victim, and then that's the beginning and the end of it. And that was what, the main thing that really made this case captivating to me, beyond the fact that it was an unsolved crime, beyond the fact that it happened practically in my own backyard, and beyond the fact of, when I come up with ideas I actually want to do a documentary on as opposed to just a simple YouTube video, I really like to do them on things that are kind of obscure, and that is really what this case is. It's an obscure case in the history of the Portland metropolitan area. I don't want to do a documentary about a case that's been covered 500 times. I love studying the crazy, twisted odyssey of the Manson family and Charles Manson, but I don't want to do a documentary about him because 500 have already been done, and who knows how many books have been written on it. I don't want to cover the same ground that a bunch of people already have. I want to break fresh ground with what I'm doing. And that's a big motivating factor from me in this case, in addition to the fact that this is not one killer, one victim type scenario. It goes a lot deeper than that, guys. And that is what I am going to try to convey with this film that I hope to have done by the end of November of this year. That's going to be rough because I think the place I work at, so many years I got really mediocre hours even though I busted my ass. And I think in the last 3 to 4 months they finally realized how badly they need me, and without even asking, they're giving me like 35, 40 hours a week. I'm actually gonna have to go in and tell them, hey, can you trim like 2 or 3 hours out of there so I can live my damn life? But yes, that is the objective. So I wanted to get here and sit down before that happens. And I mean, considering everything that's been going on in my life in the past couple of weeks, this was a perfect subject matter to do an opening podcast on. And I haven't come up with a name for this podcast. I'll, when I have 5 minutes of freedom in my life, I'll work that out too. But that's pretty much a wrap. I went into about as many of the details as I can really think of, aside from diving into the things that I want to keep secret for the film, the deep Anna Schrader details and all that stuff. I'm going to save that. And you're just going to have to suck it up and wait for the production to be completed and to come out for all to see. And it will be glorious. But until then, I need to actually get back to editing now. This is me taking a break from editing. It's just me sitting down and rambling about this case for almost an hour. But it was fun. I'm looking forward to doing more of these. I'm looking forward to doing some with other people, possibly. Me and my buddy Local Pathfinder have, for months, already talked about the potential of doing a podcast together and talking about stuff. And trust me, the two of us getting together and doing this is going to be a lot more entertaining than me doing it by myself. Try as I might to talk about cool historical stuff or cool stuff going on in my life with, an edge, with enough intrigue to make you actually want to listen and kind of be interested. Like, okay, I can groove with this guy for a while. So, as usual, lots of fresh stuff coming down the pike for y'all. But till then, podcast number 1 completed. And till next time, gang. As you know, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian. And I'll see you next time.